Hello, this is the GDPR workshop for charities, the General Data Protection Regulation workshop developed specifically for charities. My name is Tux and I'm from dataprotectionguru.com. What is this workshop? What is it all about? This workshop would introduce charities. So if you run a charity, manage a charity, work at a charity, and have a need to understand the GDPR in a bit more detail, this workshop is what you need. It introduces charities to the GDPR. It helps charities conduct a preliminary GDPR readiness assessment. So if you know about the GDPR and want to give some thought as to, are you ready for this? Are your systems, your data, your processes, are they ready for you to be compliant? This would help you. It also shows you what you need to do to comply with the GDPR on or before the imminent deadline of the 25th of May, 2018. It would cover the following, like what is the GDPR and why must you comply as a charity? How can charities comply with the GDPR? It would talk about your GDPR compliance project and touch on some potential next steps. Before we get into this, I think it might be helpful for you to know who I am and why am I the guy who can help you with this? Why am I the guy who is the expert in GDPR? My name is Tux Oyegunle. I'm a very senior cybersecurity consultant. I am a data protection expert. So my speciality is actually in data protection. So all aspects of data protection. I have been fortunate to have amassed over 23 years experience in technology. I have worked on, managed, led, directed, assisted with, consulted for many GDPR projects. So I fully understand what it means as a concept. I fully understand what charities have to do to be compliant. I also understand the risks that this carries if you do not comply. I am an alumnus of the Harvard Business School, so I have been around for a while. I fully understand how business works. I understand the link between business and technology. By way of education, I got my first degree in computing many years ago, and my master's degree in business systems analysis and design. So if we're talking about cybersecurity, I am the guy. If we're talking about data protection, specifically the GDPR, then I am your guy. You got any questions, just shoot me an email and we can help with that. Now, I wanted to talk or start by saying, why am I doing this? And I think it might be helpful for you if you're a charity. Now, I have been doing GDPR work with major corporates over the last year and a half. This has been the main theme coming up repeatedly since the deadline got set, I think in 2016. We've been quite busy. Now, more recently, over the last month or two, I started getting a lot of phone calls from charity type clients. And while many of them recognize the need to be compliant with GDPR, many of them are looking to start or have started a GDPR project in a few cases. I noticed that a lot of them were challenged by way of budget. So it seemed as if while the desire was there to comply, while the need to comply was appreciated, I don't know, I just got the impression that many of them couldn't afford my day rate, which is about £1,000 a day. So, they would say things like, oh, Tokes, how could you do something cheaper for us? Or could we work with you on a slower, slightly lesser budget and things like that. Now, when the calls became regular, that got me thinking. So I thought, okay, how could I help the charity sector with their GDPR efforts? So I thought, okay, one of the ways I can help is by putting together a free workshop, which is what this is. So you don't need to spend a dime on this. Just grab a pen, paper, and take notes. So this would help you understand, what you need to do, what the GDPR is, and then you can take decisions later as to if you want to either hire anybody or not. But that's really the driver here. How can I create tons of value for the charity sector regarding GDPR without breaking the bank. So let's get started. What is the GDPR? It stands for the General Data Protection Regulation. It's a new law coming out of the European Union that seeks to strengthen data protection for all individuals. So if you're an EU resident, if you are an EU citizen, what the EU is saying is they want to strengthen data protection for you. In a nutshell, they're trying to give control back to EU citizens. Now, the citizens are called the data subjects, and I'll go into that a little bit later. But what might help is to provide a bit of background here. So if you are in the UK, you may be familiar with the Data Protection Act, which is kind of like GDPR Phase 1, or GDPR would be the Data Protection Act Phase 2. I think sometime in 1995, we had a directive from the EU regarding how data should be regulated across society. On the back of that, in the UK, we had our Data Protection Act, and that's really the law at the moment that governs how companies, organizations can use people's personal data. But 1998, when the Data Protection Act was put, is quite a while back now. So you're looking at, it's been many years. And within that time, we've had society changing leaps and bounds. We've had big data blow up. We've had the internet blow up. We've had mobile phones in everybody's hand. And we've just had this explosion of personal data across the world, really, beyond the EU. Unfortunately, while data and the use of data, the application of data has grown in leaps and bounds, the regulation, the law controlling how data is used hasn't really changed since 1998, or say 95 when the directive came out. So what the EU are trying to do is bring data protection regulation, the law that governs how data is used, to the 21st century, for want of a better word. So now we have the laws that are now looking at data from what data is today, not what it was about 20 odd years ago. Another thing that you may find interesting is when we had the Data Protection Act in the UK, we were able to take the EU directive that we got in 1995, I think, and we can apply it locally. So in the UK, we had the Data Protection Act. In Germany, they had something different. In France, it was a different case as well. One of the things the GDPR is looking to do, at least from the EU standpoint, is to harmonize that regulatory environment. So now we will have one law for everybody, every organization across the EU. And it is effective from the 25th of May 2018. So every European company, organization or body has to be compliant with the GDPR by the 25th of May 2018. Why must charities comply with the GDPR? Now, if you're with me so far, you're probably in a charity in one capacity or another. Look, the EU imposes severe penalties for non-compliance. It's almost as if they have taken a position that personal data is of immense importance, and they will be a lot firmer in how they ensure that organizations comply. Now, depending on the nature of the offense or breach regarding data protection, there are fines, humongous fines, which could potentially be up to 20 million euro or 4% of annual global revenue, whichever is the greater amount. And that starts to, I think, very quickly demonstrate the level of importance that the EU are putting around this. And I'll give you an example. I had a corporate client that I helped with their GDPR project. Now, they had revenues, I think, of about 10 billion per annum. Okay. Now, when we were looking at the risk assessment, we realized that, well, 4% of that was about 400 million. And what the EU are doing, they're very smart about this. They say it could be up to 20 million euro or 4%. But they also stipulate in the regulation that it would be whichever is the greater amount. So if you've got large revenues, then this is even more of a risk to you. So we have the penalties, which I think is one of the reasons why charities must comply. But if for a minute we move away from penalties and we just look at cybersecurity in itself, what we are finding increasingly lately is that we're getting more and more hacks, breaches of systems. More recently, we had the Equifax breach, in which I think over 100,000 records, personal records of people, were gained access to by the cyber criminals. We in the UK have had issues with other banks here who have lost data, and it goes on and on. I mean, we had something happen with the NHS a while back when they had this issue and some hackers took over their systems, and so it's a big deal. Now, cybersecurity is a big risk for charities. Charities, unfortunately, are not known for spending the most on their technology or their solutions, and the bad guys know that. So charities are now seen in many ways as a soft target. So while the major corporates like the banks are putting in millions into beefing up their systems, a lot of charities are not doing that, which means it's only a matter of time before cyber criminals put a lot more attention into the charity sector. So I do need you to realize that the GDPR, while it's regulation regarding personal data, you should look at it as an opportunity to make sure that your cybersecurity risk is as low as it could be. I'd like to talk about the business risk very quickly. Charities may get shut down for non-compliance. You are in a very regulated sector, so you have the Charities Commission to deal with, you have the EU information and the ICO now to deal with. So, it's just common sense to make sure that, look, we're covered. Okay? I want to start with some very basic GDPR terminology. These are just terms you will hear bandied around, and it might help you to quickly understand what it means. The data subject. Under GDPR, the data subject is really anybody that could be identified directly or indirectly. So you listening to this would definitely be a data subject. I'm a data subject. It's really people. The EU only stipulate that a data subject can only be an alive person. So that's the thing in the regulation. Personal data. This is any information that relates to the data subject. So, your name, your address, your age, your date of birth, your postcode, your telephone number, your email, just any data. PII is a term you should be aware of, and it stands for personally identifiable information. And I guess here we're taking things a step further. We're looking at information by which you can be identified directly or indirectly. So if I have information about you in my systems that could be used to identify you, then I must ensure that that information is compliant under the GDPR, okay, or at least how I'm processing that information. The data controller. The data controller is any organization who is in charge of deciding the purposes, the means of processing personal data. So most charities would be seen as a data controller. The data processor, on the other hand, and there's a slight distinction here, the data processor is any organization who processes personal data on behalf of the controller. I think an example would be very helpful for you here. Let's say, for instance, as a charity, you want to do a fundraising campaign. So you've taken the view, probably with the trustees, to do a fundraising campaign. So you bring in house a marketing company and you give them a list, or you tell them to go and get a list of people that may or may not donate. The company that you hire, the marketing company, by example, would be seen as a data processor, while the charity hiring them would be seen as the data controller. And I guess something I should throw in here very quickly that we didn't have under the Data Protection Act, but we will have under the GDPR, is we didn't really recognize the data processor under the Data Protection Act. But now, as a controller, you are liable for whatever the data processor does. So if you're you've got people out there that you're using to help you do things like this, then you probably do have to pay a bit more attention to how they're using the data and whether they themselves are GDPR compliant. Another term is the DPO, which is the Data Protection Officer. The GDPR stipulates that some companies now have to hire a data protection officer who would be somewhat independent to the organization, but in charge of ensuring that the organization is compliant with the GDPR. We'll talk a little bit about that later. I spoke about personally identifiable information, and I just thought as a charity, this list might help you to start to think. Now, do you have, and I need you to start thinking about what kind of data, personal data, do you currently store, use, process, distribute that could be used to identify people. So if we look at donors, so do you have a list of your donors? Do you have them stored in a database? Do you have them in an Excel file? Do you have their name, their address, the amount they donated recently, probably their bank details? Are they on some kind of direct debit with you? What about volunteers? Most charities tend to have volunteers. Now, do you have their name, their personal details, their phone number? Employees, do your staff, trustees, your clients. A lot of charities are actually schools. And while schools may not necessarily have a lot of volunteers, they would have a lot of clients by way of students, the students' parents. What are you doing with that data? How are you storing that data? Are you GDPR compliant? And then finally, I'd like you to just take a minute or two to think about other stakeholders you may have within your charity ecosystem that you may have personal data about them. There may be suppliers, there could be anything, but just give some thought to this. Give some thought to these items here and start to jot down where you may be storing personal details. Okay. Now, there are a key set of privacy principles under the GDPR, and there are also the data subject rights. So if you remember earlier on in the workshop, I mentioned that, look, the European Union is giving power back to the data subject. And how they've done that is simply by giving us a whole set of rights, a whole set of privileges that we now can exert. Okay, some of them were actually in existence under the Data Protection Act, but we have some that are actually brand new. I'll talk very quickly. If you look at the privacy principles, you have the principles of lawfulness, fairness, and transparency. You have the principle of purpose limitation, data minimization, accuracy, storage limitation, integrity and confidentiality, accountability, and compliance. Under the data subject rights, you have these 8 rights that people now will have from May 2018. The right to information, the right to access, the right to rectification, the right to be forgotten, the right to restrict processing, the right to notification, the right to data portability, the right to appropriate decision making. I'll pick on 1 or 2 of these very quickly. If you take, for instance, the right to notification, this is where if in event of a breach of your systems, now people now have the right to be notified about this breach. And I think you have to tell them within, I think it's 72 hours. So think about that regarding your systems, your procedures, your business systems at the moment. If there was a breach, are you set up to notify everybody within 72 hours about what has happened? Another interesting one is the right to access. So under the GDPR, people now have rights to access whatever personal information you store about them. A key difference here was historically we had that right under the Data Protection Act, but companies were allowed to charge. So if someone said to your charity, please send me whatever information you had about me, you were able to say, well, I can do that and I need to charge, I don't know, £20 or £50 or whatever the case may be. Under the GDPR, you would now have to, you're mandated to provide that information for free. So not only do you have to have the manpower, the resources to locate and collate the data, you have to now provide it at no cost to the data subject. There are many others that we can get into, and I think I have a slide further down which kind of touches on the key points. So I'll move on for want of time. Good, this is the slide. So these are the key changes that GDPR bring in. So if anything, this probably is one of the most important slides in this workshop, and I would implore you to give ample thought to everything here, and I'll go through it very quickly. So PII, what is PII? What is personally identifiable information? The definition has been expanded. So now it includes a lot more indirect identifiers. For instance, people's IP address, the location data on your phone. Things like that, we now know you can be identified with your IP address. So does your website store people's IP address? Do your systems store people's IP address? And if it does, can you delete it if required? There's an increased territorial scope regarding GDPR. The impact is now global, but it's specifically relatable to anyone, anywhere, handling EU residents PII. So I have had clients who were actually based outside the EU, but they were using data from people within the EU and they still had to be compliant. Something you might note. The penalties up to 4% now, or 20 million, whatever's the greater amount. We've discussed that. Consent is huge. Now there are a lot more tougher conditions around consent. It must be clear and for a specific purpose. So to understand this, just think of the process by which you're getting people's personal data. For some charities, it's from their website. From some charities, it's from people subscribing to something. But when you're getting that data, it might just be their email. It might just be their phone number. It might just be their name and address. Are you getting their consent? You have to now explicitly, clearly get consent from the data subject before you can use that data for anything. Secondly, consent has to be for a specific purpose. What do I mean by that? Well, if you're getting my details and you want to use it for marketing, then you have to tell me. But you can't now use it for something else if what you told me was it would only be used for marketing. And that brings in the question of reconsenting. So you may need to collect consent again if your use changes. What does that mean to you? Well, it means you probably need to give ample thought to what do you need this data for? You probably need to give ample thought to how am I going to communicate to the data subject exactly what I need the data for. Breach notification. This will be mandatory. You have to report, and it must be done within 72 hours. I guess the issue here is, what would it mean if you get hacked? What would it do to your charity? What would it do to your brand? What would it do to your image? Do you store personal data that it may be an embarrassment? How would you handle that? Right to access. Here we have the subject access requests, another very popular one. People can now ask if or how you're using their personal data, and you have to provide it to them for free. There's a right to be forgotten. This is another very interesting one. So people can approach you now and say, look, I know you have my data, but I no longer want you to have my data. Can you please delete all my personal data from your system? And it's very easy to see that as a very simple thing. Oh, it's just a delete, I'll delete that. But the things you need to think about is, okay, what exactly does that mean to you as a charity? So questions would be things like, okay, in how many places am I storing that data? Can I delete it? Have I backed it up? So if I delete it from my main database, what about if I have to go to a backup? Would it still be there? Have I uploaded it to the cloud? Am I storing this with any third party? These are things you need to think about. The data portability is another very interesting one. People can now come and say, look, And I not only want you to delete my data, I now want you to provide it to your competitor. We would wait and see how that plays out, but it may be something used in future. Privacy by design. The EU are now stipulating that data protection, must be actively included in systems design. So when we are putting together our systems now, we have to think of data protection as an integral part of the design of these systems. And then finally, here we have the data protection officer, which would be mandatory for some firms. I think a good thing, though, is they have said while it's mandatory for some firms to have a data protection officer, you do not necessarily have to hire the data protection officer in-house. So you may be able to outsource that function. You may be able to even share a data protection officer. So there are ways that could be mitigated. Is your charity ready for the GDPR? Now, one of the first things we do with the GDPR project is we conduct a GDPR readiness assessment, okay? Which means we come in and do a comprehensive survey of your systems regarding policy and governance, your business processes and data, your systems and technology. And through that, you would very quickly start to understand, oh, I'm okay in this area, oh, I may have some challenges here. And I'll give you a few questions that may probably help you to think about this, okay? Do you store any data on systems outside your direct control? Are you storing any IP addresses? Are you able to delete the IP addresses? Some people have websites that store IP addresses that they don't even know about. So you may need to reach out to whoever's in charge of your tech and try and figure out, am I storing IP addresses? Okay. How sure are you that your personal data is secure? So what processes do you have in place in terms of virus control? What security do you have in place for your network? Is your data accurate? Is it up to date? Can your data be exported in a portable and open format? There are a whole host of questions. I'll talk about a couple more from a policy and governance point. What kind of training has your senior management had on GDPR? What about your entire team? How much do they know about this? How are you in terms of your privacy policies? Have they been updated? Are they now GDPR compliant? Have you made any preparations in terms of a data protection impact assessment? It's another thing that needs to happen. Have you analyzed every single point of data collection to make sure that you're getting consent along the way? Do you even know where all private personal data in your organization is stored? So, and I don't want to bore you with this, but this is really how you would know if you're ready for GDPR. Okay. There are a whole load of other questions as well, but it forms part of the GDPR readiness assessment, which really would be the first aspect. Then the question is, how can your charity comply with the GDPR? How? Well, first thing is you need to review and revise how you collect and process personal data. And once you're clear on this, then you need to ensure that, look, it's in line with all the GDPR requirements. A very simple way to put it is, if you remember the slide we had earlier that spoke about the rights that data subjects would now have, well, you need to ensure that you are not infringing upon any of those rights with how you're handling personal data. And, that's the kind of thinking that you need to have to comply. How you comply is by having a GDPR compliance project. Now, what is this? It's a regulation-based, compliance-driven project to simply make sure that you map and document all your current products, your services and processes to make sure that you're now compliant with the GDPR. So there's a whole lot of processes we go through, but these are the things you need to start doing. And successfully achieving GDPR compliance is the goal of this project. So have you started a GDPR project? If you haven't, do you think you would need one? So if you haven't started the project, maybe you need to do a readiness assessment. Look at those questions I asked earlier, or reach out to us and we can help you with a more robust way to look at this. But these are the kind of questions you need to start to explore. Do you need help with your GDPR project? Look, this is all we do. We are the GDPR specialists, particularly in the charity sector. If you have found any value from this and would like to take this forward, I would strongly suggest you join our GDPR Masterclass now. What is the GDPR Masterclass? It's a 3-week intensive GDPR training and coaching program delivered by myself with yourself and your team. It's delivered via 5 webinars and teleseminars. We provide detailed insight into the complete GDPR compliance project. It's been designed exclusively for charities, so you get the benefit of working with a process that's specific for your type of business. It's the best value for money. Like I said, a lot of charities struggle to pay my daily rate of £1,000 a day. But with the GDPR Masterclass, we train quite a few charities together in a group. So we take a group of you through this, so it becomes cheaper for you. You have access to a peer community. So not only do you learn more about how you need to do the project, you learn about what other charities are doing. And that is very helpful. I mean, I've had that people just in listening to questions that other charities are asking, they go, wow, okay, so I need to do that. Well, I'll just copy that as well. So you have access to that peer community for the duration of the masterclass. You also have interactive question and answer sessions where, you can come back and ask any question at any time during the course, and then we answer that for you, technically or otherwise. So I would strongly suggest you consider this if you really want to move forward with your GDPR compliance project. Register for the GDPR Masterclass now at dataprotectionguru.com. Thank you very much for your time. I look forward to seeing you on the other side. This is Tux. Bye.